Okay, and we are live this hour with Ramiro Funez. Very, very excited. He is a journalist, revolutionary, one of the founding members of Anti-Conquista, which is a great site as well as online platform. So we're really, really excited to have you here for this hour, Ramiro. Before we get really started into the things that you're kind of known for, let's start. Let's take the story back to the beginning. So, how did you get politicized? How did you get involved in the world of radical politics?
What's up, everybody? Shout out to Matt for having me on. Shout out to everybody listening right now, to all of our people in the diaspora, Latin American and Caribbean diaspora, Anticonquista. We definitely enjoy the work that you do, Matt, and others, and we're happy to facilitate a space for dialogue among our people. In terms of I always get a tongue twister saying this word, politicization. I began moving toward leftist politics in 2009. So my family's from Honduras. I was born in New York, born and raised in New York, in Queens, and my family emigrated from Honduras to New York. And in 2009, there was a coup against Manuel Zelaya, who was a left-leaning, more liberal but progressive president in Honduras, and he was removed in a U.S.-backed coup. And there was so much chaos. It affected a lot of people. There was a lot of repression in Honduras, and for my country to experience one of the clearest examples of imperialism under the presidency of Barack Obama, because just a year before Obama was elected, and I was actually excited for Obama to be president, and I was excited to have a black U.S. president. And then I was like, okay, cool. And then like a year later, the coup happened, and it turned out that he and Hillary Clinton obviously played a big role in facilitating the coup, which has devastated the country. And so since then, I kind of have been politicized. Also, that same year, there was the election of Mauricio Funez in El Salvador with the FMLN, which was exciting. And at the time, because obviously he turned out much different. But I was really excited about the rise of the left in Latin America, even though in Honduras a leftist leader had just been taken out. Hugo Chavez was becoming really popular at the time as well, and he was delivering a lot of speeches against U.S. imperialism and opposing capitalism. And so around 2009 is really when I began starting to get interested in politics, especially socialist politics.
So around the time of the coup, as well as the disappointment with Barack Obama, you go from that to where you are now. So somebody that would be enthusiastic about the election of Barack Obama to somebody who's now critical of U.S. imperialism, critical of the empire, critical of that. There seems to be a lot of steps in there. So what were some of the earlier readings you got that began to really help you make sense of the world that we're all living in?
I think one of the other aspects that made me move toward socialism and understand the capitalist reality was also the financial crisis. In 2008, there was the subprime mortgage crisis. My parents had just bought a home in 2005, 2006, around that time. Luckily, they were able to keep it, but that was a concern on my mind constantly: is, are my parents going to lose their home during this crisis? And connecting like the war at home with the war abroad, right? It's like, even though there's like millions of families who are being pushed out of their homes that they own, they just want to survive. They're already working like 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week. They can't afford to live in their homes. Yet the U.S. is spending so much money on wars, trying to overthrow governments everywhere. In the case of Honduras in 2009, a lot of money was spent to get rid of Zelaya. And so seeing that connection between the war at home and poverty and imperialism abroad really brought it full circle for me. And then obviously in 2011, Occupy Wall Street was definitely another big advance in that socialist awakening. I was still living in New York at the time, and I saw how many people came out to the protests. I started reading socialist and communist literature, and little by little, I just began understanding what capitalism and imperialism are.
So when did your writing career begin? When did you actually begin writing about these issues, and what were some of the early publications?
So it's funny, and I grew up, like as I mentioned, I grew up in New York and in Queens, and I started journalism around, I want to say, actually kind of around the same time, interestingly enough, like 2009, 2010. In New York, I started writing and doing photography for a bunch of small newspapers and like Queens neighborhood newspapers, and I did some freelance work like that while I was in college, and covering some local stories. And a lot of the local stories were about like homelessness and poverty, police brutality, and like for example, one of the stories, like I used to, I'm from Southside Queens, and in Southside Queens, there's a big Black and Latino population. And I was covering some of the stories about police brutality in Southside Queens, how police were beating up young Black kids in Jamaica. And then I went to a press conference and I saw this guy's face who had just been beaten by cops, and it was like totally destroyed. And like seeing stuff like that, covering local news like that, covering poverty and social issues, also really helped to awaken my consciousness. I started getting into journalism around that time, and I realized that journalism as an institution had a lot of contradictions. It had a lot of issues because on the one hand, while it can be used to expose a lot of social issues like police brutality, poverty, homelessness, on the other hand, it is completely dominated by bourgeois commercial interests and interests that are against the interests of the people. And so I started realizing that media and journalism itself, that there was a class of people who were controlling it. And unfortunately, I from that moment, I realized I wanted to do something a little differently. And from then on, I've just been totally against like mainstream media. And that's been one of my main things, is like critiquing mainstream media. One of the series that I do for Anticonquista is decolonizing media, which I need to catch up on. Actually, I've been slacking on that, but basically I try to break down like the garbage, the nonsense that we get from mainstream media about capitalism, imperialism, and try to break it down. So, and a last point on this is my favorite quote. One of my favorite quotes from Malcolm X is this quote about the media, where he says, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. It has the power to make you believe your friends are your enemies and your enemies are your friends. And that quote has always been embedded in my mind in terms of understanding the role of media and how the function it serves in colonizing our people and keeping us oppressed and in wanting to worship these commodities and lifestyles that are imposed on us and sold to us. And so that's really how I got into like leftist media is and although I'm cool with the label journalist and stuff like that, but for me, I like to say like I'm a revolutionary propagandist or a socialist propagandist, because I'm straight up with people. I tell people right off the bat, like, yeah, I'm a leftist. I'm against capitalism. I'm not going to try to act like I'm impartial and have no bias. Everyone does, it's better I just be straight up with you and tell you.
Yeah. Well, okay, next time I'll bill you as a propagandist.
You're gonna put me on the watch list or something.
I mean, I'll see you at HUAC, right?
Right.
No snitching, right? So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about get into talking about like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whatever, the mainstream news, their lies and distortions a little later. But also I want to talk a little bit about not just the big things. I mean, there's also these like kind of like smaller sites like Remezcla, they're kind of full of misinformation as well. I want to get into that, but before we do that, I do want to get into just a little bit more about, like, because I know you wrote articles for Telesur for a minute, and then from there formed Anticonquista. Can you talk a little bit about the formation of Anticonquista and how that kind of came to be?
Yeah. So basically, so there's 5 co-editors of Anticonquista. It's myself, Ofelia Carrillo, my partner, who's also here in LA. Carlos Cruz, who's in London. He's a Colombian comrade. Nick Ayala, who is he's from Newark, but he lives out here in the West Coast as well. I think he's Puerto Rican, Dominican. And then our other comrade, Rich, in West Virginia, who's Colombian as well. And the 5 of us came together, and we realized that there is a need for media for our people in the diaspora from Latin America and the Caribbean that isn't moving people toward liberalism. So to give you some background, 3 of us of the 5 co-editors used to work at Telesur English. We lived in Ecuador, in Quito. And it was interesting. Like me personally, like around that time period that I mentioned earlier, 2008, 2009, I was watching Telesur. That was actually when I started watching Telesur a lot because they were covering the coup in a way that a lot of other outlets weren't. So it's like, yo, that's so dope how like, you know, there's this Latin American media project and they're covering all this stuff going on from a leftist anti-imperialist perspective. And then like, so I'm like, cool, dope, da, da, da. So then like years later, like when we actually are working there in Quito in Ecuador, we realized like, hold up, like this spot internally was run by a lot of white liberals who were moving it in a direction that was away from its radical roots, away from Latin American socialism, moving more toward the model of like BBC and Al Jazeera and trying to be neutral and objective. And today on, you know, and like this outdated kind of model that is also depoliticized. That is also like we were told on several occasions. You know, I don't want to like, you know, I don't want to say specific names and stuff like that, but there are certain people in the institution who were saying like, oh yeah, don't use the word imperialism. You're not allowed to use the word imperialism. You're not allowed to use the word Marxist, this and that. And we're like, what the fuck? Like, this is fucking, you know, this is our media. It's supposed to be a tool for our people in our class. And it just didn't turn out that way. And so that's why we decided to kick off Anticonquista as like a revolutionary, anti-imperialist, Latino, communist, like space for us to do the content that we want to do. That's like this, where it's conversational and it's real and it's relatable to people in our class who are like, you know, putting groceries or cleaning buildings, and they're just like doing manual labor, and they could just chill and listen. And they were, you know, Telesur was trying to go in the opposite kind of direction, and so we decided to do our own thing, you know, and it's been very successful. And one last point about that as well is one of the aspects that makes the work that we do different from a lot of other media outlets is that not only do we produce content that's for our people to educate our people about what's going on in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also like revolutionary communism. We also, all the funds that we collect, we don't keep a single penny of it. For us, it's not a livelihood. We don't make a wage from it. We're not an NGO. That money we use to support movements back in Latin America and the Caribbean that are actually serving the people. And we've been able to already send money to groups in Haiti and Puerto Rico and Colombia. We're about to send some money to some comrades in Chile who are organizing the Mapuche indigenous people. So we're putting our money where our mouths are, and we're not just like talking about it and trying to, you know, make a buck out of it, but we're actually like trying to. That's our role here in the belly of the beast, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, that's all fantastic. You know, no, you know, I appreciate the fact that you don't want to name names and stuff like that, but that guy was the personification of a walking fedora. I mean, that guy was terrible. That
Yeah,
guy,
yeah.
like, you know, I wrote articles that were like published there, and like that,
Yeah.
that guy was very, yeah.
He was literally a walking fedora.
He was a walking fedora.
He was that ass a walking fedora. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was.
All right, so let's get into some of the content. I watched a couple of videos in preparations for this. The one you did on Bernie Sanders was very interesting to me. So, what kind of there's a lot that has come out of the kind of Bernie Sanders thing, but I think one of the more interesting things we can talk about is how it's kind of like his campaign is really, the fact of his campaign really kind of depoliticized the word socialism and revolution. Like both these words have been completely stripped of meaning. I mean, and I would really lay most of that at the feet of the Sanders campaign. I mean, what do you think?
Definitely. I in my opinion, I don't think Bernie Sanders was or ever will be a socialist. I think that I would describe Bernie Sanders as a social imperialist or a social democrat in the first world in an imperialist country, who a Keynesian, you know, because there's like the economic model of Keynesianism after John Maynard Keynes, who is a British economist, and basically his solution after the Great Depression, his solution to the problem of capitalism under crisis was, you know, let's spend, build a state capitalism, spend money on programs which are good, right? Like I think people should be able, the government should be providing social programs, benefits to the people, etc. The thing is, in the imperialist countries like the US, all of that is built on exploited labor, exploited capital from the global South. that every hour of every day is stolen of its natural resources, its labor, and there's a parasitic relationship between the first world, the U.S., and the third world around the world. And so when you have people like Bernie Sanders or, for example, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who are wanting to expand social programs and bring more benefits to the people in the U.S., it's like, okay, on the one hand, it's good because, I think obviously nobody should starve, nobody should go homeless, stuff like that. But it's all built on exploited and stolen wealth from the third world through the imperialist system. And so I think that's why it's so important to really like make that distinction, because like, for example, if Bernie Sanders, like you talk to certain people in Latin America who are like left leaning, who are socialists, and the way they speak is similar to Bernie Sanders, but the context is different, because like you can't compare, for example, like the US to, like Honduras, like where my family's from, or Haiti, or anywhere else in Latin America where there is no capitalism. Like capitalism has exploited the whole economy to the point where there's no local industry. And so for me, Bernie Sanders, getting back to the whole thing about socialism, like I definitely wouldn't say he was a socialist, because socialism is about controlling the means of production, about profits in command. I mean, about the people in command, not profits in command as it is under capitalism. You need an organized party, a movement to take the means of the state and to direct the economy in 5-year plans under worker control. That's like socialism, and the stuff that he was proposing was just social imperialism and Keynesianism, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not just like that he wasn't a socialist. That the word socialism, I feel, has taken a, even though it was like a dirty word, now it's a less dirty word or something like that in people's mind. That's always presented as progress, but in many ways, I mean, maybe there's an argument to be made there, but there's also something very regressive about the fact that socialism has been stripped of its meaning. That socialism is like getting a better dental plan. You know what I mean? Like war with dental plans. You know, that's now what socialism is. And that's not a good thing. And the fact that revolution has also, like this is our revolution. Our revolution is the ballot box voting for this guy who's going to countries.
Yeah,
like, that's not a good thing. It's just not a good thing. Yeah.
No, you're definitely right, man. And I think the word socialism has, and shout out to Dust James, by the way, I see in the chat. What's up, Dust? The thing about socialism is that it's been slandered by its two deviations, in my opinion. Me speaking as a communist, I think so. The word socialism in the U.S. has gone in two directions. People see it one of two ways. Either A, it's like, free healthcare, or like, legalized weed, or like these minor programs here in the first world. You know what I'm saying? Like low tuition or whatever. Like these social democratic reforms, right? That's like the one view of socialism. Then the other one is like, soy lattes, and like the right wing mocking of the left is like weakness, postmodern, like what we affiliate with the postmodern left, right? Like where it's like you're against everything, but you're not for anything. You're just complaining, everything, and so for me, like when I see those two understandings of socialism in the U.S., I'm like, it's so different from the way people view socialists and communists in the third world, in the global South, where they're fucking like gangsters, like communists in the global South are like cool. They're the people who are like serving the people, and it's culturally like it's people look up to the communists as like those are the warriors of our people, our class, and unfortunately in the U.S. it's not seen like that. And I think the reason for that, I would say the reason for that is because my personal opinion, I don't think the contradictions are yet ripe for a socialist revolution, a real socialist revolution in the U.S. Because of its role as an imperialist power. And so obviously, like in the global South, to everybody, it makes sense that capitalism doesn't work. Yeah. Like, you go to I've been to Bangladesh, like when I was in Bangladesh, like socialism and communism are so popular because everyone sees how much of a failure capitalism has been. Yeah. And so the communists who are like, yeah, like we're fighting to overthrow the system, they're cool. But here, it's like capitalism has brought wealth to the white settler European class. And so they're like, what? Socialism? I don't want that, So it's a different relationship, I think.
I think it'll require space aliens to make communism cool. You know, make an enemy more powerful. I mean, that seems to be the common thread here is that so much of like what makes socialism and communism like in places that it's actually happened was that it was paired with like a national liberation struggle as well. I mean, that seems to be the case throughout much of the world. I mean, even in the case of Russia, there's still like a lot of English and French capital, like permeating. So it seems like oftentimes that those things are paired. It's very difficult to like wage like to really build an internal communist movement inside an imperialist country. It's very. I'm not saying it can't be done because everything can't be done until it's done, right? I'm just saying it's hard to find historical precedents for like how to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So another thing with we're talking about here with the decolonizing the media series, I want to talk about the major things, but like I noticed. I mean, the first thing that brought anti-conquista to my attention was an article about, I think it was written by, I want to say, Lola Campos, and it was why this new Latinx media, or why new Latinx media is not revolutionary, something like that. And one of the people they took on site was Romescla, who like I just recently wrote an article for Telehawar called the Trojan Gusano. Like
I like that.
yeah, that's how we are. We're a little less professional than you guys, but anyways,
That's all good.
it takes different strokes, right? But yeah. So like, can we talk a little bit about that? Like, these sites, We Are Me Too, Romescla, etc. Why these oftentimes have these very right wing deviations?
Well, I think whenever we look at an institution, a party, or a media outlet, we always have to follow where's the money coming from, who's paying for it, and why. The intent, right? We always got to follow the money. And if you look at, I think, for example, one of the earlier ones was Fusion, which I think was like an offshoot of like Univision or Telemundo or something like that. Me Too and Remezcla are also connected to that kind of like the liberal wing of journalism, of mainstream media. They are connected to mainstream media, but they're just a different face of mainstream media. And I think with that in mind, we can understand like, okay, even though on appearance, the stuff they're saying may seem more to the left or more radical, in essence, they're basically mainstream media, and because they're funded by mainstream media, and they're just a different rebranding of mainstream media. And I think it's really comes from a commercial viewpoint. I bet it was just maybe like some people in a boardroom of like some mainstream media corporation. They're like, we need to access the Latino market. What can we do? And they're like, oh, we have this rising, because it's true. Young Latinos are a rising demographic in the U.S. Like in general, there's over 60 million. I always say this. We always talk about this with Anticonquista. I was like, there's over 60 million Latin American and Caribbean people in the diaspora in the U.S. and Canada, UK, and most of those are young people. That's a big market. That's bigger than most countries, And so, a lot of the white liberal establishment media, they want that slice. They want to dominate that. For them, it's a market, a new market to access, because it's a market that hasn't really been tapped in yet. With the exception of maybe like Latino Rebels or like other stuff like that. It hasn't really been like super commodified yet. And so for them, like that's how I view it. Like they saw it as like a source of profit. They're like, yeah, let's corner the young Latino market and let's make these articles about like hot Cheetos and pupusas and this and that. And it's like, okay, like once you understand that, you can see why it's not that they moved to the right or that they became more liberal. It's that from the very beginning, that was their intended purpose, is to be basically like a more liberal, left-leaning, and just chill face of like mainstream corporate media. And I think that's how we have to understand it. And the thing with like Me Too and Remezcla is that like, yes, they are talking about Latino issues. They are uplifting certain aspects of the culture, but so much of it is decontextualized in terms of like class and economics. Like, and I think it's meant to direct people back into liberal politics, into Democratic Party politics. It's basically like an outfielder. I call it like, for example, the Democrats. I always make this comparison to like outfielders. The Democrats are like the outfielders of U.S. imperialism, in the sense that like they're identifying like, okay, what groups of society are increasingly like hostile to the U.S., don't want to be associated with the U.S., or being oppressed by the U.S., and how do we bring them back in to like vote, and do this and do that. And it's like, and I feel like groups like Me Too, Remezcla, and all that stuff, like they're kind of like part of that in the ideological sense of like, how do we make these young Latinos feel like they have a voice and relatable and stuff, but then we bring that back to voting, and like, oh, we need to get the Latino vote, we need to get in Biden for, and it's like, what the fuck, like, so yeah, I'm glad you called them out, and I think it needs to be I think they definitely need to be called out, and even more importantly, kudos to you as well, is we also need to offer an alternative, right? We also need to create parallel media institutions. So it's not just about like complaining about them, but like literally outdoing them, like just having better shit. And I think like the stuff that Telejaguar is doing, the stuff that Anticonquista is doing, other outlets, like we're part of that. We're creating a whole new infrastructure to the point where people don't have to go to those whack ass sites for like interesting articles, and they can come to us. And so we're still building that now, but I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, yeah. In the case of Remezcla, we can move on to this, but in the case of Remezcla, if you look through their archives, they have an article where they refer to Juan Guaido as a beacon of hope. They have an article where it's Gloria Estefan celebrating the death of Fidel Castro. They have an article where it says the literal headline is Chavez is now brainwashing children. They have an article where it says Evo's new shoe tying bodyguard has his critics thinking he's no longer Evo from the block.
Wow.
So I think it's not just the fact that it's pupusas and pupusas are cool, and it's not just tortas and tortas are cool, and it's not just salsa and salsa's cool, but where's the meat? It's no, they're through, like the celebration of, like through the celebration of San Jorocho or something, they're gonna sneak in like, like imperial, like hard right imperial politics that you probably wouldn't even see on NPR or anything. I mean, like hard, like opinion pieces. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, definitely. That's definitely the intended goal, and it's like it's subversion. You're subverting our people into like supporting. It's like 5 ways to make plátanos. Oh, by the way, support regime change against Venezuela. Like what? Like where did that come from? And because they're not providing like solid political perspective, like people, they're gonna get drawn in by those little appetizers, right? Of like culture and da da da. And then they're gonna like see like, oh, I like Me Too and Remezcla, so they must have a good line on Venezuela or whatever. And we see it. I can't tell you how many times when the protests were going on and all the rounds, because there's all these. It's like the Venezuelan opposition is like a virus. Like every few years they come back worse and worse, and they the last few times that they started having the protests, like so many people were sharing like shit like that, like Remezcla and Me Too, and like, oh, Guaido is good and that. And so it's like they're definitely subverting our people toward imperialist politics, and that's why I'm glad that you called them out, and we're gonna continue to do stuff like that.
Excellent, excellent. So let's talk a little bit about the politics of Guaido, because I mean he has, like oftentimes in this country right now, I mean at this moment there's supposedly a quote unquote resistance to Trump, but Guaido was well received in Congress and a standing ovation during the State of the Union. So what accounts for this bipartisan support of Guaido, and who is this man? For those in the audience who don't know.
So Juan Guaido is the guy from Venezuela who proclaimed himself president in January 2019. Came out of nowhere, to be honest with you, and he was never even really that known. Declared himself president, tried to start a coup against Maduro, et cetera, et cetera. And what I find really fascinating about his reception in the U.S. in Congress was that both parties were standing up and clapping for him, and both parties opened up their arms to him. And it just exposed the fact that U.S. imperialism is a two-headed snake. It's a two-faced monster with the Democrats on one hand and the Republicans on the other. And they both supported Guaido. Most people, in the U.S. government voted on the budget that supports the NED funds to the Venezuelan opposition. Even people like AOC, who people are always like, oh, AOC, so like even people like that, what I'm saying, like that they support the Venezuelan opposition, and the Bolivian, the right-wing coup government as well. And so it's like Guaido's reception, I think, from both parties just symbolizes the duality of U.S. imperialism and how it has a liberal democratic wing, Republican conservative wing, and I think like even the fact that, for example, the European Union, most European Union countries, like if you look at the countries that endorse that recognize Guaido versus the countries that recognize Maduro, you'll notice a pattern. Like most of the countries that endorse Guaido are mainly white first world countries that would love a slice of the pie of the Venezuelan oil market, you know. And most of the countries that recognize Maduro are like, you know, African countries, Asian countries, really poor countries, and even that in itself just shows you, you know. And it's just like it just shows you who's behind the Venezuelan opposition, who they represent, and yeah, the Democrats, they 100% support regime change in Venezuela. They just, you know, there's a wing I think that tries to brand itself like an anti-war wing of the Democrats and da da da. But like at the end of the day, like they still support sanctions, they still support regime change, they still parrot the same nonsense about like peaceful protest, and it's just disgusting.
Yeah, you mentioned within that AOC. I remember there was a video where she was talking about the necessity of a regime change in Venezuela, and she was chopping a pineapple at the time. I think it was like, you know, in her apartment, and she was kind of just like, you know, doing a little deeper. She's trying to just be like, hey, I'm a person, and
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, and so like that was kind of her thing, chopping this pineapple. But like to me, the optics were terrible because it reminded me of The Godfather Part Two. You know,
Yeah.
Hyman,
Hyman Roth.
yeah,
Yeah.
he comes to kick a Cuba, and he gives a little bit of Michael, gives a little bit to like the Rosado brothers, some of that. And he's like giving like piece of the cake, so it seemed like she's chopping the pineapple, like, oh, this part, this is Caracas, like,
Right.
like,
For real.
um, but for real, but can you talk a little bit, because I know that she's very popular,
Yeah.
amongst a lot of people, but she's still part of that. She's kind of, I mean, like, you know, nobody lives forever, right? Father Time is undefeated. So Bernie Sanders is eventually going to put out the pasture. He's going to eventually have to make his exit. And it seems like there's a whole, not just AOC, but a whole group of people coming up. And if Bernie is very enduring, or very endearing, because he reminds people of like an old, like kind of like old Jewish grandpa or something like that people like, that's recognizable to people and it's very, you know, endearing in one way. That's nothing compared to like the heartstrings that the AOC and the rest of the squad are going to bring, because those are like, you know, young, powerful women of color, and so that's going to, the optics of that are going to be very difficult to defeat. But their politics, can you speak a little to what their actual politics are?
Yeah. I mean, I think people like AOC and the squad and the resistance or whatever the fuck they call themselves, they're nothing but tokens for imperialism, and they represent capitalism. They represent imperialism. They want cosmetic changes to capitalism that benefits only people in the U.S. and they're not talking about getting rid of, you know, U.S. banks, reparations for mass reparations, or even just dismantling this country. Like they do not represent like a real socialism that would oppose U.S. imperialism from the belly of the beast. And so for me, like AOC and the squad and all of them, I think they represent the wing of the Democrats that's very what's the word? They're smart. Here's the thing, like Democrats, I gotta give it to them in terms of their strategists. They're fucking smart because they know that by putting women of color as your face of the party, and obviously we're against, you know, the oppression of women. We're against you know, obviously racism and sexism. And so what they do, they're creating a narrative. They're setting the narrative already, so that if you critique AOC, like if they decide to go with AOC or Ayanna Pressley or Ilhan Omar or I forget, Rashida Tlaib or like anyone else like that, they're gonna say, "Oh, are you critiquing opposing a woman of color?" You know, and oh, why are you? And so it's like, no, like it's not because of that. I'm opposing them because of their imperialist policies, because they're just bringing cosmetic changes to capitalism and stuff like that. And so I think like in that aspect, the Democrats are kind of grooming them to be the face of the Democratic Party, to be kind of like the intersectional face. And let's not forget that that's actually been the tactic of U.S. imperialism within the last 50 or so years. Like there was a turning point where in World War II, like in the lead up to World War II, the way the U.S. slandered socialism and communism was based on fear and based on making them seem radical. right? Like communists are radical extremists, subversives, like the Reds, they're trying to bring down the country. Then they realized something. Okay, we got to switch that because that actually brought more people to communism and socialism. Because then you're like hyping it up, right? You're like, yo, this group of people, they're crazy. Like they're trying to change society, and they're like, yeah, I want that, you know.
Yeah.
But it's like, so they were like, okay, we're gonna flip it. And so after World War II, with the '60s and the rise of the hippie movement and the counterculture and postmodernism and identity politics and all this stuff, like they were able to, the CIA like literally invested millions and millions of dollars into these think tanks and small little liberal groups in California, all over the U.S. As the Congress for Cultural Freedom, as like the new left that was like, oh, we're against, you know, the Soviet Union, we're socialists and we're feminists, but we're against the Soviet Union. We think the Soviet Union should be dismantled. You know, we're against Cuba. We're against, you know what I'm saying? And so they use that like branding of like bourgeois feminism and like liberalism to oppose like actually existing socialist countries. And so I think they're kind of like a 21st century continuation of that, where they're using women of color as tokens, as puppets in a way to advance their imperialist agendas, and presenting those who oppose them as like conservative and cold. You know, for example, like the whole Tiananmen Square stuff. That's a perfect example of how the U.S. imperialist narrative about socialism has changed. Because before, it used to be like communism was and socialism was portrayed as the person like resisting or fighting, and now they switched it where it's like socialism is no longer human; it's a tank, it's a cold tank that's running over a liberal, creative individual, you know. And it's like, and so that they were, Democrats were the ones who mastered that, and they're continuing that strategy. And I think like AOC, using Ayani Presley, all these people who are so-called socialists to attack real socialists in the global South. I think that strategy works very well for Democrats, and I think that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah. Can you speak a little bit more about that? I actually the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Yeah.
What was that?
So my friend Caleb, my longtime friend Caleb Maupin, he's an independent journalist. He's been doing a lot of research on it, and I've read a lot of his stuff about it, his research on it. But basically, after World War II, the CIA needed to switch up its tactics in terms of subverting the Soviet Union and bringing it down. And one of the tactics, one of the commissions that they created, and you can look this up. This is actually on the CIA like website itself. Like that this is like at this point has been public record. They created the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which basically would organize like, you know, cultural events in the Soviet Union that were like postmodern and stuff like that. They would have like splats of paint, and it's like, oh, we're unique and different. Because you had like for example, like one of my favorite artists, Siqueiros from Mexico, right? Who is a Mexican muralist, that's socialist realism, where he's portraying the images of people, working class people, that humans look like humans. It has a message, it has a goal. It's art for the people, right? It's a communist art. So that's like, for me, like that's like more like better art. It's better art. And so the postmodernists, the liberals, they started creating this abstract art. And so the Congress of Cultural Freedom started doing that. It's like they started basically trying to push as much postmodernism, media, hosting conferences, pamphlets, leaflets into the Soviet Union, to portray the Communist Party as like conservative and backward, and they don't want to adapt to the new change. You have the Tavistock Institute, which was like the institutes that was doing experiments with LSD and drugs and like Woodstock and shit like that. And you had the rise of this hippie left in the U.S. that was in large part supported by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Ramparts magazine, like ContraPoints magazine, you know, the rise of like Noam Chomsky, and there's people who, the rise of this new left in the U.S. that was very connected to the CIA left, the State Department left, and they were used to oppose, like, for example, the Sandinistas, to oppose like Angola, and so, you know, I think the Congress for Cultural Freedom, we have to really understand. I suggest checking out my friend Caleb's work on it. He's done a lot of coverage about it and research. But if you look it up, Congress for Cultural Freedom, it's crazy. Like they did all this stuff, and now that manifests itself in the form of like the National Endowment for Democracy, for example. Carl Gershom, who is the president. Let me just get his name, because he is the only president. Carl Gershman, the National Endowment for Democracy. He's the president. He's been the president since like Reagan era.
Mhm.
He was actually a quote unquote socialist. He was in like a Trotskyist group in the U.S., the Young Socialist League or something like that. That it was part of that group of Trotskyists that were supported by the State Department. A lot of Trotskyists who became neocons, Irving Kristol, a lot of, and they formed part of that new left in the U.S. where they were like, they were the ones who got professor jobs. They were the ones allowed in mainstream media as long as you oppose the Soviet Union, but on socialist grounds. You don't that they figured out the strategy of beating back communists with democratic socialism.
Right. Right. So that's just really fascinating. I've actually never heard of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I mean, I knew, I'm looking it up right now. I knew Jackson Pollock was connected to the CIA. That I knew. So I get this is just I don't know. Maybe I didn't. I never imagined that was an isolated thing. So that kind of okay. This makes a lot of sense. So a lot of this kind of postmodernist kind of what are facts? Let us a ruthless interrogation of our own methodological imaginary, right? Where the fuck they're saying these politics really do actually emanate from the State Department, no?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. That's where it comes from. And even like the opposition, you look at the opposition protests in Venezuela, same thing, right? The same model. And they were funded by the NED, Carl Gershom and that whole crew of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The opposition protests in Nicaragua, that they use the branding of environmentalism and even try to hire a few indigenous people in Nicaragua and be like, oh, these are indigenous people resisting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and using them as basically like props, and that's been the tactic, is like, we're going to attack the left from the left or from the synthetic left. And it's been very successful, and people still fall for that shit all the time. The hashtag SOS Venezuela, SOS Nicaragua, Cuba. And it's something that we have to really keep an eye out for, because imperialism is constantly adapting. And it's one of the mistakes. Like, I think one of the mistakes the left makes is they don't adapt to the new conditions and try new methods of organization. They're still acting like it's 1920s, and you can go to a street corner and like yell and hand out a leaflet and be like, workers of the world.
Yeah.
We're not in that time period anymore. And we have to adapt our agitprop to the new conditions. We have to organize people in new conditions. The imperialists understand that, and they understand that better than us on the left. And part of that has been like using the strategy of attacking the left from the left. And I think that the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the NED, all that is so important to understand.
But I really feel like the things from the 70s, the 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the time period which NED was formed, and many of the things are going on with the NED to this day, like all across the world, they're very sophisticated. A lot of what's going on today, it's coming out of the academy and postmodern kind of stuff like that. It's getting so nakedly ridiculous. I mean, it's just getting absurd to the point where people are developing this like set of politics where it's like, I'm right because I'm me, and I'm right about everything because I'm me. How dare you?
How dare you, Matt?
I've been having these arguments with people. Someone told me that the nation state was founded on whiteness, and then that was it. And that's the definitive statement. The nation, like, you guys are nationalists, and the nation state was defended on whiteness. I don't want to hear anything, you trash man. My response to that is to like post a picture of Oscar the Grouch. Like, that doesn't work with me, right? But like, but the thing about that is that like the idea that, like, let's take that for instance. Someone saying the nation state was founded on whiteness. Like, so, I mean, I guess you could argue that early European nations were founded on colonialism. I mean, like they drew their borders like in the 16, 17, 1800s, right? On the basis of like capturing their markets and stuff like that. So there's that. But if it was founded on whiteness, why would there be a bunch of countries in Europe if it was just like
right, yeah.
Nation state? And so, why are there many nation states in Europe? I mean, first of all, that doesn't make sense. I'm getting into like personal stuff right now, but the point is, like, these lines of argumentation that make no sense and cannot be challenged, or you're done. Is what this has evolved into. I mean, at least Jackson Pollock could like explain why his painting was good. I mean, I don't know if it was any good, but he could explain, like, he could give some kind of semblance of an explanation.
Right. But, no, that's a good point that you raise, and I think part of that is the failure, the purposeful erasure of a real Marxist scientific outlook, because
Yeah.
When you like, I remember when I first started getting into leftism, I was like, damn, like it's all these like hippies and it's all about just like counterculture and blah blah blah. And then like once you actually read like dialectical materialism and Marxism, the science of Marxism, you see that it's a certain outlook, and you have to have a certain a scientific way of understanding the world. And I think the reason that unfortunately many people are like that, who are the how dare you people, is that they don't have a scientific Marxist approach. They that hasn't been taught to, and that going back to the Congress for Cultural Freedom conversation we're having right now, that was part of it. Is erasing the contributions of Marxist theoreticians about philosophy, about how Marxists understand reality, and replacing it with idealism and radical subjectivism. So, for example, as communists, as materialists, we understand that material reality determines consciousness. So your economic class, your position within capitalism determines events in society. And so like you can't understand whiteness without understanding capitalism and imperialism as the base, as the core. But for a lot of the postmodernists, they see it in as race is the primary thing, or gender, or everything else but class. And that was one of the techniques that the Congress for Cultural Freedom used. There was a term that you'll probably have heard, and that is called economic reductionist. That
Yeah.
people who it's a term that liberals use it a lot of times again. And that's not to say I'm only view it in a class way. Obviously, as someone who's like from Latin America and the Caribbean, I think Black and Indigenous people should be uplifted. I think LGBTQ people should be uplifted. But my primary understanding of society is through proletariat and bourgeoisie, the class struggle, and that's been kind of erased from Marxism, where it's all subjective. And the other component of Marxist science is understanding objective reality. There is such a thing as objective reality. The sky is objectively there. Like we objectively move around the sun. Like there are things that are independent of whatever we think. But a lot of the postmodernists, they're like, well, it's my truth, my truth, my. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. Like there's the truth. And as communists, our goal is to understand what the truth is and use it to liberate our class and our people. And so we've devolved into this era where not only do people think that truth is relative, that truth is whatever you think it to be your truth, but they also don't understand that economics and your position within the capitalist mode of production is what determines everything else. Capitalism created slavery and racism, not the other way around. And so it's like we have to understand it like that. And I think it connects with what we were just talking about like the subversion of Marxism, the same way hip hop was subverted, from its revolutionary roots, like in the 80s and shit. Like once the cocaine started coming in from the Contras, they started flooding the hood with cocaine, subverting hip hop, subverting all this culture. They've done the same with Marxism. And it was around the same time too, where they started promoting hippie culture. They started promoting like radical subjectivism, where it's like, oh, anything is true, and so as communists, we have to like really go back to our roots and understand the real science of Marxism.
Yeah. I mean, it's when we talk about like the Latin kind of American diaspora people living here in the States, I mean, like the poverty rates we experience are really high. You start disaggregating that information. I come from my background. I'm Mexican. I know you're Honduran, so I mean, like a lot of the different groups, if you look at them specifically, are experiencing rates of poverty at a very, very. I mean, I looked at this one time not that long ago, and I think that the Honduran rate of poverty in the U.S. is like something like 24% of Honduran Americans live in poverty, and for Mexicanos, I think it was like 20. I think it was like 20. I think it might have been 25, 26, something like that. So it was around the same. Look at the literacy rates. Look at this. All these things. These are economic questions. And our place within the economy is like. I mean, it's how we live. I mean, when we talk about economy, we talk about class. It's not distinct from like who we are and who our parents were, or whatever. The class reductionist thing is ridiculous. It's just it's an absurd way of moving the conversation away from economy, which is how we live.
Yeah, no, 100%, and we have to understand it that way. And that's also going into what you were mentioning with like nationalism and stuff. Like that's also my critique of a lot of my fellow Central American people who really are big on this whole like Mexican hegemony stuff, and really are like trying to create divisions between our people. Obviously, I understand that there chauvinism exists, racism exists everywhere. Um, but in terms of like you just said, like you just cited the economic data, like our people are basically shoulder to shoulder in poverty. You know what I'm
Yep.
saying? Like in New York, like I said, I'm from New York. A lot of the compas who are like making pizzas in the back, who are working, who open and close in New York, they're like Mexican and Honduran, and they live together, they work together, and they're going through the same issues. And so when people view things only from the perspective of race or nationality or everything else but class, they can get lost into this thing where they're like, oh well, Mexicans are in power and they're oppressing, Central Americans, and I don't agree, because it's like, you look at the way, for example, during the caravans that were leaving Honduras through Mexico, you see like the solidarity that people had with each other, and obviously shit happens, right? Whenever you have people like because of capitalism and imperialism being forced to cohabitate, or being pushed together, you're always obviously going to have clashes. But there was so much solidarity, because they were part of the same class, because they were part of the same levels of poverty, and they understood. And so like for me, and that's why I think having a Marxist class first view is so important, because if you don't have that, then you're only going to see like nationality or any other identity, and that is so common within like the liberal postmodernist view that's so out there in the Latino spaces, unfortunately. And that's what we're trying to change at the Conquista, and that's part of like the stuff that we do, is to like combine, because they're not interchangeable. Like people act like they're like, oh, you're gonna follow this old European white guy Marx from Europe, who, no, I'm a real like indigenous Latin American. And it's like it's both. Like you look at like the writings of Mariátegui, Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru, who was one of the pioneers of like indigenous socialism. You look at Farabundo Martí in El Salvador, who was a Marxist and indigenous, and was fighting like to build the Communist Party in El Salvador. They combined them. They're not mutually exclusive. You adapt Marxism to the local conditions. You apply it to how it is there, and it has a class-based perspective. And we need to get back to that. We need to get to the point where we're not getting upset, where we're not saying "how dare you" every day, where it's all about like me and my. It's like, no, it's about our class, our collective people as poor Latinos. Like, how the fuck are we gonna solve this problem?
Yeah. Well, I think we really need to get things on a material analysis. We need to get things on the basis of material analysis, and not just this weird like finger pointing thing. Like, it was you, it was you, it was you, it was you. Like I got you, I got you. I have some points now. Like, put some points in my little point jar. I got you.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of. Maybe you did get me, but like I don't. We're still poor. I'm like, I don't.
Right.
But yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate you saying that, because I know that the phraseology of Mexican hegemony has become really big, and that's another piece of this kind of like postmodern argument. And and I know the guy that started it. I mean, and he draws cartoons of himself lighter than he is. I mean, like, it's weird. It's a weirdo. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. I'm not gonna talk about him. Anyways, yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming on. So what can people expect from Anta Conquista? What's coming up? What's going on with the podcast and everything else?
Hey, everything's all good, man. With Anticonquista, we've been like busy, like we've all been putting in work, articles, videos, podcasts. So we definitely have more podcasts coming up. We just released a podcast a few days ago that we did with Ron Goches from Unión del Barrio about the history of Salvadoran socialism. If y'all can check that out, we have some great articles on our site that we just published about Venezuela from Comrade Carlos. Great pieces from Comrade Nick about COVID-19, socialism versus capitalism on our site. And Ophelia has also been and is also working on a piece, I believe, about Mexico and AMLO. So a lot of us, we're busy, man. Like, that's pretty much all we do. Like, we're just, we're at the point where it's like there's so much dumb, like, unfortunately on the left, so many times people wait around for shit to do, and they're like, oh, should I join this group or that group? It's like, yo, like, let's get to work. Like, let's put in work, let's do shit, and we'll figure out the shit later, And so that's kind of our mentality. We're just like putting in work. We're fundraising money to send back to Latin America. we're producing content, and it's those two things, but that's a lot in itself, I think. And I think our contribution, we're just trying to get better every day. You know what I'm saying? Every day we're trying to work hard to serve our people. The goal is to get to the point where we have so much content, so many shows, so many articles and videos that we can replace Univision, that we can replace Telemundo, that we can even Netflix, because Netflix, they're trying to capitalize on the abuelita market right now.
Yeah.
They're creating all these novelas, and they're like, yo, but then they're like, again, redirecting it in a bourgeois liberal way. So it's like our goal, like maybe it's a lofty goal, but like is to get even bigger than Netflix, where we can have like biopics about revolutionaries, like have series, like dramatized series about like Zapata or other people, you know what I'm saying, Sandino, or and build, like we're trying to build media. And then on the political and financial aspect, we're working to get to the point where we help the most oppressed groups in Latin America and the Caribbean to the point where they're able to get state power and create liberated spaces in Latin America with our solidarity. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's over 60 million Latin American and Caribbean people in the diaspora. That's bigger than most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have the power to shut down the U.S. economy overnight. If Latinos came together, if the U.S. invaded Venezuela, for example, if all Latinos went on strike, we can shut down the U.S. economy overnight. Not a problem. And we can get to that point if we build and organize and not be super sectarian, which unfortunately is also another problem on the left, that people are like, oh, you did this one ideologically impure thing in 2011, so fuck you, like you're the worst.
Forever.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah, exactly. So it's like we're not about that either. Like we're just trying to work, serve our people, do the best we can, and that's pretty much what it's all about.
All right, so I got 2 important questions. You mentioned, I mean, because you left me something really big right now with the fact that you're going to compete with Netflix. Have you seen the series they're running on Simón Bolívar?
I haven't seen it, actually. No.
60 episodes, and it says season 1, so that's a pretty lofty goal.
Yeah.
But it's wild. But I've been watching. It's kind of like a telenovela. It's very dramatic. It's okay. I mean, it's got history in it, but it's very dramatic. The other question I have was for you was so I've been posing this question to everyone who's got background training in Marxism, who is a Marxist or has read extensively Marx. So why is it it's not a difficult question, but it's just I'm always interested to see how different Marxists answer it differently, right? So why is it that a market system is always going to fail to provide people what they need in a health pandemic?
I think the market system, the free market system of capitalism, is always going to fail to meet the people's needs because it's not centered around human need, it's centered around profit. The science, one of the beautiful aspects of Marxism is understanding scientifically why capitalism not only is irrational, but is doomed to fail because profit is built in. You have what's called surplus value in every commodity, which is basically the amount that the capitalist exploits from the worker when they create a commodity. So for example, if I produce sneakers and I have a factory in LA, and I pay my workers $10 an hour, and the sneaker costs $100, like once I sell it, I make $90, right? Given I have a few expenses like rent and materials and all that, but I have a $90 surplus value profit. Now, if I move production to Haiti and I pay my workers $1 an hour and I make $99, now that's called the super profit. My profits are going up, and it's built on exploitation of labor. And the Haitian workers are not making less because they're lazier or because they're inefficient, but because of imperialism, because of exploitation, because those companies have the power to send in the Marines to be like, get to fucking work. So because of capitalism and imperialism, you have what's called the surplus value that's built into every dollar, every financial transaction. And that means that you have the creation of fictitious debt, credit card debt. The world is in debt to itself. Like, how the fuck are you in debt to yourself and you create a system? So it's built on the foundations of capitalism. Exploitation is built in, and that exploitation at some point is going to burst as a contradiction, as a crisis. It's bound to happen, just as feudalism burst, just as slavery, the system of slavery burst. capitalism will also come to an end, and a new system will replace it. And the market system will not solve the people's needs because it's built on the expansion of that profit. That's the only thing. Like, people build houses not because there's homeless people who need homes, but because they want to make profits, right? Because they want to make money. And so it's a parasitic being that just needs to keep expanding, keep expanding. It kills its host, and then it moves on to another host once it can. And so at some point, there's going to run out of food. It's going to run out of hosts, and it's just going to totally die from the inside. And that's why scientifically, the capitalism does not work. It does not work, and the market has no solution for our people. We have to get to a point where we can follow the concept of from each according to their ability to each according to their need, where people work. It's not like, under socialism, you're just like chilling all day, smoking bud. As much as that sounds pretty chill too, you have to work. Like, there's a certain aspect of, and the goal is to use technology in a way that we can automate most of the work we need to do so that humans can spend more time with their family, do more creative arts. That's really what socialism is about. And in order to do that, like, we still have to overthrow capitalism. And so the free market in general does not offer solutions for the people because it doesn't seek to make things better for the people. It seeks to maximize its own profit. And so it's time for us as workers to, there's a famous Marx quote where he says that, like, under capitalism, man is a slave to his to the things that he produces. We bow down to the commodities that we created as humans. And so under socialism, it should be the other way around. The humans are in control of technology. We could use shit like Amazon and drones to bring diapers and food to families, you know what I'm saying? So that people don't even have to leave their houses. Like, during a crisis like this, COVID, like, we have the infrastructure and technology to use drones to send people the equipment, the food that they need, the money they need, but it's not being rationally organized in that way. And so that's really why capitalism is just, it doesn't even fucking make sense, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time you spent here. I think maybe like some of the answers to this last question, it begs another conversation. Maybe we can have another conversation about automation and technology and just how deeply that has affected millennial as well as like Gen Z workers. I mean, we're really entering into a different type of economy than our predecessors, and I think that caused a lot of the boomer, kind of some of the reactionary kind of stuff against boomers and just not material look at things. That's another conversation maybe we could have down the line, because that really is a rich topic. But I thank you for this hour. This has been really great. What should people do to support the work you're currently doing, like working in Anti-Conquista?
For sure, man. Thank you for having me. Shout out to all the other quarters of Anti-Conquista. You can follow us at Anti-Conquista, Facebook, Twitter, IG. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You could also listen to our podcast on Spotify, iTunes. We have plenty of stuff on there. And if you want to hit us up, if you want to submit content or anything like that, email info@anticonquista.com. And also shout out to Telejaguar, shout out to you, Matt. The stuff that you're doing is great, and I'm hoping that we can collab more in the future.
Yeah. Everyone will be so pleased with that. And just not to get shown up by you on my own show, shout out to the rest of my team at Telejaguar. Shout out to Ernesto, Maria, and Corena. And because like it's a group effort, as I'm sure Anti-Conquista is a group effort. So thank you so much.
Peace out, man. Thank you.